Today is not Ascension Day, and will never be on a Sunday because Ascension Day, the day when many across the Christian world observe or commemorate the story that we just heard read to us from Acts chapter 1, it always occurs 40 days after Easter. So that was this past Thursday. Okay? Next Sunday will be 50 days after Easter, and it will be Pentecost Sunday. So we're going to take some time today to reflect on Ascension. This is typically when, if churches do observe Ascension Day, it's typically observed on this particular Sunday. And I want to reflect with you on the story. And it's a story that's really only related to us in the two-volume work of Luke Acts. There is a mention of Ascension or Jesus being lifted up in the later ending that was added on to the Gospel of Mark, but that was added on by another author. We don't know who. But only the story of Ascension is found in this two-volume work of Luke and Acts. But it's found in both of them. They're told slightly differently in the two, Luke and Acts. One's expanded on and at least gives a longer period of time, it appears, between the time of Jesus' resurrection and the story of his ascension. I want to read to you the verse from Luke chapter 24, verses 50 and 51. It says, "Then Jesus led his disciples out as far as Bethany, and lifting up his hands, he blessed them. While he was blessing them, he withdrew from them and was carried up into heaven." And then in Acts, the second volume, after detailing that longer period of time, it says, "When Jesus had said this, as his disciples were watching, he was lifted up, and a cloud took him out of their sight." I want to examine these two accounts with you this morning and address why the author wrote the stories the way he did and the significance of these stories for people like us in the 21st century. The title of my talk today is Liftoff. In a month and a half, we're about to celebrate, arguably, the most significant thing our species has ever achieved. That is the Apollo 11 lunar landing next month in July, 50 years ago this year. Wow. We walked on the moon. On the front of the bulletin there is actually from Apollo 8, this iconic photograph called Earthrise, or at least the appearance of Earthrise, taken as Apollo 8 circled the moon and orbited the moon. And it's a beautiful photograph. And by the way, it became so iconic that it helped it further embolden the environmentalist movement in this country as we begin to see the image of the Earth and how fragile the planet appears to be against the dark sky of the surrounding universe. I share these words with you this morning because as I talk about Jesus' liftoff, I want to explore with you at the beginning of how differently we've come to view the cosmos, the universe. There's a story, and you know, we weren't the first, Americans weren't the first, we didn't have the first human in space. Anybody know who that was? Yeah, a Russian cosmonaut by the name of Yuri Gagarin. There's a quote that's been sometimes falsely attributed to Yuri Gagarin that actually is apparently from Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, when he was speaking to the Central Committee of the Soviet Union. Khrushchev said just after Gagarin had had his successful flight, Khrushchev said of Gagarin, Gagarin has traveled into space and he did not find God. He said that to be smug. Of course, you know, Soviet communism was committed to a position of atheism. Gagarin was actually a member of the Russian Orthodox Church in his life. But that story was provocative, intended to be provocative, because it raises a question of how that in the modern world, our perspectives of the universe are so different from those in the ancient world. You say, why is that relevant to the ascension? Well, we're talking about Jesus rising up into the clouds and disappearing beyond the clouds into heaven, the presence or the abode of God. Well, naturally, when you get into a spaceship, a rocket, and you lift off from the earth and you either achieve orbit or beyond, you quickly realize that just beyond the clouds is not the dwelling place of God. But the ancient people, the ancient world out of which the Bible emerged, didn't see the universe in that way. I provided inside your bulletin something I think you ought to look at from time to time when you're reading the Bible. I want to give credit here. This is from Logos Bible Software. I found it some years ago, and there are different depictions of this. I just thought this one was the best that I had seen graphically. It shows you an image of how the ancient Hebrews and much of the rest of their world viewed the cosmos, the universe. Very different from ours. If you look at this sometimes, you can study and read some of the captions on there. But I want to show you, it's harder to see, but if you can study, if you will, well, put your reading glasses on. But let me just show you, and you can go back and read scriptures and you can see where this view kind of bleeds through, okay? All the way back to the opening chapter of Genesis. The idea is that the earth is when they didn't use the earth as in terms of a planet, they meant the dirt, the land. We think of earth as a planet. This is small e earth, okay? This is the earth in which humans lived. And this is, of course, the sky. And this firmament, remember from the old King James Version, the firmament literally means the hard thing, the dome. This dome holds the waters above the firmament, you know, where rain comes from, right? And when one of the flood stories says the windows of heaven were opened and the water rushed back in to return the earth to its original watery chaos. That's in one of the stories about the flood. And so here we are living on the earth. You got the sky above. The stars and the moon and the sun just move within this dome. They would have thought they would have been very close to the earth, or at least relatively close. The mountains hold up the pillars or the foundation of the heavens. Perhaps even holding up this dome. Imagine you're in a domed stadium. And inside that dome, that's all the human activity takes place there. But beyond the dome is holding back water. And beyond the waters, up here is where God dwells. Not so far away in the minds of the ancients. Sheol is the place of the dead. By the way, and when I was growing up, we still talked about heaven being up there and hell or Sheol, Hades, being down below. We thought of it in kind of a geospatial way, and that way as a kid I thought that. And because we got that from reading the Bible, because they talked that way. There's the great deep and the waters that are under the earth, that the earth kind of floats on, the foundations of the earth, and so forth. But when you get that idea, it explains a whole lot of things when you read the Bible. Even in the way this ascension story is told. Jesus disappears into the clouds and he goes directly into heaven. In other words, he didn't travel past, from our conception, and travel past the moon and Mars and Jupiter and Saturn and going on. No. They didn't conceive of the universe in the way that we now understand it. Now, I was talking to someone one time who was a very conservative Christian, and they said, well, the world used to be that. The universe used to be. No. Don't go away with me trying to give you the impression that there was a time back then when the universe was that. It was never that way. They conceived of it that way, and so when they told the stories about these kinds of things, they told it in light of the world in which they understood. But that brings us to a problem today in the modern world. We've got to wrestle with how we read these stories today. All right? And I want to talk a little bit about that and how we still can find significance in this story, even if we have trouble reading it literally because we no longer believe that kind of universe exists. By the way, keep that in your Bible somewhere, because when you're reading through stories, keep that in your mind. Get that mental picture of how ancient people viewed their understanding of the world, their understanding of the cosmic order. But let's go back to the text we find at the end of Luke and in the first chapter of the book of Acts. I'll kind of run through a couple of thoughts about those two stories and how they're a little different, even though they're very similar. First of all, in the Gospel of Luke, we're told that Jesus appeared a third time to some of his disciples after his resurrection to share a meal with them, open their minds to understand the scriptures about himself, and tell them to remain in Jerusalem until they're clothed with power. Jesus and his disciples, after having this moment, if you will, probably in the upper room, we're not told a time frame here. When you read the last chapter of the Gospel of Luke, you would think it's all happening in boom, 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 one day. Because they have this meal together. Remember, Jesus asked for a piece of broiled fish. He ate the fish to prove that he was flesh and blood, according to Luke's version. He goes through the entire Hebrew Scriptures, pointing out his interpretation of his life in view of the ancient Hebrew Scriptures to his disciples. And then he gives them those stern instructions. Stay in Jerusalem. Very different from Matthew's Gospel, which tells them to go to Galilee. Luke says, stay in Jerusalem. Don't leave Jerusalem until you're clothed with power from on high. Anticipation of what we'll talk about next week on Pentecost Sunday. Then it says Jesus and his disciples left wherever they were in Jerusalem and journeyed east as far as Bethany. This would have taken them over the Mount of Olives. Olivet is sometimes referred to. This is significant because the Mount of Olives was the place in the ancient Hebrew text from the Old Testament that says that when the day of Yahweh occurs, that the Lord will descend on the Mount of Olives. So there's rich symbolism here. He's taking them out there, and then he begins to just kind of rise. He's lifted up out of their sight after he had blessed them. He departs. Well, the author of Luke Acts writes his second volume. And he's not quite satisfied with the way he told it the first time, because he wants to expand on it. So in Acts chapter 1, this brings us to number 2, in the second volume, we're told that Jesus spent 40 days with his disciples after his resurrection, teaching them about the kingdom of God before he led them out to the Mount of Olives, where he's lifted up in the cloud out of sight. So it says for 40 days. Now, there's no mention of 40 days in Luke chapter 24. If you just read Luke chapter 24, you'd think it all happened maybe in, one night or 1 week at least. But when you read Acts 1, it says 40 days. Why is that 40 days? Where did that come from? We don't know. It's very likely that the author was trying to recapitulate or recast the disciples' experience like he had done Jesus in his experience. Because you remember, Jesus too had a 40-day period in the wilderness of preparation. So it's very likely the author was trying to make that parallel, because he does that throughout the book of Acts. He recasts, he almost retells stories that were first associated with things Jesus said and did, and then shows the disciples doing those very same things. Here he says Jesus spent 40 days with his disciples between his resurrection and his ascension, teaching them about, the kingdom of God, which was his central message. And they're wondering, are you going to restore the kingdom to Israel at this time? Jesus says, not for you to know the times that have been that are in the Father's hands. They're his decision to be made. And after saying this to them, telling them to stay in Jerusalem until they're clothed or gifted with power from on high by the Holy Spirit, again, he goes out to Mount of Olives, east of Jerusalem. And we're told when he gets there, he begins to be taken up into the clouds out of their sight. And in this version of the story, there's a reappearance of these two men in white. We have always presumed they are angels, and they tell the disciples, why do you stand here looking up into the heavens? It's saying Jesus will return to you in like manner. Where? To the Mount of Olives, which was the anticipation for the early Christian church that the Lord would descend once again, just as he has ascended to the Mount of Olives in his return. So that's the way those two stories are told. They're different, but they're same. One you could just say is a more condensed version of the second one, where the author expands on it. He wrote both of them. Apparently the same person wrote both of them. Well, how do we read these stories today? I already told you they had a very different world than we did. They envisioned one than we do today. The universe doesn't really work like that, literally. And I grew up in a tradition that we had to take every bit of this literally. This literally occurred just as it was. If you'd had a video camera there, you would have seen Jesus physically experiencing liftoff into the clouds and then going immediately into heaven just beyond the firmament, the hard thing, the dome, the little window. He goes in the window, presumably, right into the presence of God. I believe that. I thought that as a kid because everybody taught me that. Must we believe that today? I don't think so. I think I know what this author is doing. And I want to try to spend a few moments explaining what the author is doing. Throughout Luke Acts, he casts the Jesus and his his earliest followers as prophets like Elijah and Elisha. Now, it may have been a long time since you studied this in Sunday school. I hope we're not reaching a generation of people who are increasingly biblically illiterate, because these are very important stories. And I want to share with you a story from the Old Testament that I believe colored the way this author told the story of Jesus' ascension. So I'll relate that to you. This is where we are. Throughout Luke Acts, Jesus and his disciples are portrayed as prophets of God in the spirit of Elijah and Elisha. You remember when Jesus went to his hometown synagogue, according to Luke's gospel? You remember the story? We covered it a few months ago now, I guess it seems like. Well, a few months. Jesus read from the book of Isaiah to his hometown synagogue. They were all pleased with him. And then Jesus has makes a turn. And he then kind of rebukes his hometown synagogue. And he tells two stories about two characters. One was Elijah and one was Elisha. And he characterizes his ministry as being like that of Elijah and Elisha. Because you remember in the stories, Jesus said Elijah and Elisha did their best work outside Israel, among the non-Jewish population. And this made his hometown synagogue so mad they were going to throw him off a cliff. But he got away. Remember the story? That's not an accident. Only Luke's gospel says that Jesus brought up Elijah and Elisha and portrayed himself as being like them. So what's the story of Elijah and Elisha? You go back to the Kings. I give you a reference there from 2 Kings chapter 2. This is the particular story I'm referring to. Let me give you a little background. Elijah was a prophet of Yahweh. He was a thorn in the side of King Ahab and Queen Jezebel. He was a prophet that denounced them because, well, according to the story, and they always blame the woman, Jezebel comes in and she brings her gods from her own foreign nation that she is from. She brings them into the kingdom that is ruled by King Ahab, and she introduced the prophets of Baal. Remember the prophets of Baal? Elijah has a big showdown with 400 prophets of Baal where they both cry out for fire from heaven. Remember the story? It says Elijah ends up killing all 400 prophets of Baal. It's a very tough world to live in, okay? So Elijah was a tough guy. He was a prophet of Yahweh, and he has this pretty esteemed career. He performs a lot of different kinds of miracles. Well, it comes time for Elijah to pass off the scene, and Elijah has some followers, at least 50 prophets, we're told, and the foremost among them is a guy named Elisha. Now, think about this. It's a little complicated. Elijah, Elisha, okay? Got to keep them straight. Elijah's the old guy. Elisha is his successor. So Elisha gets wind of the fact that Elijah's about to depart. He's about to leave. And he keeps following him around everywhere, crossing the Jordan here and there, wherever. He knows he's about to leave. Elisha wants to make sure he's there when Elijah goes. And not only that, he asks specifically of Elijah that he receive from Elisha a double portion of the Spirit that empowered you to do these powerful works as a prophet of God. Remember that? And it literally says that Elijah has a mantle, okay? Not the one above a fireplace, but he's wearing a mantle. You've heard passing your mantle on? That's where this comes from. He uses his mantle, he strikes the Jordan, he crosses over on dry land, he and Elisha, and he is going to pass off or leave behind the mantle that Elijah will assume. But what happens? How does Elijah leave this world? Anybody recall? Fairly dramatic, a little unusual. They're standing there talking in Elijah's final moments with Elisha. Elisha's already made the request for a double portion of his spirit. And then all of a sudden something dramatic occurs. Elisha says, I see the chariots of heaven with fire. And in a whirlwind, we're told, Elijah is carried up into the heavens to be with God. And all that's left with Elisha is Elijah's mantle, which he picks up and assumes himself. And if you read the story carefully, Elisha performs twice the number of miracles that Elijah performed. Double portion of the Spirit. You got that? All right. Powerful story. Powerful story. What are the similarities between that story and the story of Jesus' ascension? Jesus is about to leave, just like Elijah was. His followers are very concerned about that, because just like then, as we think today, when the great man leaves or the great person leaves, what's the future going to be like? Will we be able to carry on? Will we be able to continue to do his works in the world? And they're there with him, and all of a sudden he begins to depart from this world. By the way, next week we'll talk about the fire and the whirlwind on Pentecost, okay? So hang with me for next week. Come back. Yeah. So just as Elijah departs this world, he leaves with his successor Elisha, the double portion of his spirit, where Elisha will not only do what Elijah did, he will do greater things than Elijah, his predecessor, did. I believe the way that this author tells this story is to remind his hearers of that ancient story of Elijah and Elisha, and to let them know, don't worry, just because Jesus is gone, that doesn't mean that things are going to get worse. They're going to get better, because you are going to multiply the presence and mission of Jesus in the world. You're going to receive his spirit, and it's going to empower you to continue to do his works and even greater works. By the way, Jesus said that. You recall that? He says, you'll do greater works than I did. How? Because it'll be a multiplied effort. I think he tells the story in the way he did, not so we'll obsess over the literal, geospatial questions of where is heaven or what's the cosmos like. I think the story is told to give comfort to those who continue to follow in the days of the author, to say, just because Jesus is gone, that doesn't mean that God has lost his power. God's power is multiplied through you. And I bring that here to the 21st century for us. It's still true of human beings. We think when that, as I mentioned before, when that great person, that great leader is gone, we think, well, things will never be the same. That need not be so. But it's up to us, isn't it? It's easy to say, well, that person's gone, all the power therefore must be gone. No, each of us, every new generation has to come forward if the faith is to survive. If we're continuing to have the presence of God in our own world, every new generation has to come forward. And they have to multiply the efforts of those who've gone on before, so that they'll continue to go out into the world and do good as Jesus did. To go out in the spirit of Jesus and trust that God is still among us, that God is still at work. And use the multiplied efforts of every person in this room and every person who follows Jesus to spread into their neighborhoods, into their homes, in their places of work, business, into their places of leisure. Wherever you are, be the presence of Christ. Don't say, well, the big man is gone, the great man or the great woman is gone. What can we do? No, we can do tremendous things if we'll realize the power that is available to us. And that the Spirit of Jesus continues to live on anywhere you find people living out their lives consistent with his character and his conduct, and going about doing good in his name. So today, when I think about Ascension Sunday, I don't think about it just as some historical, literal thing that's something from the past, but as the ongoing, as we talked about in the responsive reading, this ongoing mission that we all have as followers of Jesus, wherever God has put us, wherever we are, to go out and try to transform the world that we are individually a part of. Do not leave the good work to the great men and women. It's for all of us who are empowered by Jesus' Spirit to go out and continue to do today. For me, that is the most important message, the most enduring message of Ascension Day. The day we see Jesus go away is not the last chapter. It's the prologue to a whole new set of chapters that we have to write individually and collectively as a people of God.